All right, does this work? Okay, so to repeat, Tim Shank, co-editor of Dissent. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and it's my job tonight to introduce our panelists. So to begin, immediately to my left, we have Quinn Slobodian, who, starting around 2013, I described as the best kept secret of the American historical profession. I would go to these conferences, and without fail, Quinn would deliver an excellent talk, have really thoughtful commentary, really thoughtful questions, and we all knew that he was working on a book that was going to be very important. That book, Globalists, is the reason why the secret about Quinn Slobodian is now out. Everyone knows who he is, and that's all to the good of the world. Globalists, the End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism is a path-breaking account of what neoliberals actually thought and how they've actually influenced the world. On the other side of the table, we have his interlocutor tonight, Adam Tooze, author most recently of Crashed, How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World. He's an author of several other books, most of which are actually around this size, and all of which are significant intellectual contributions worthy of the page count, which I'm sure everyone here knows, not always the case for books this long. Adams established himself as one of the premier students of 20th century political economy, not just in his home base of Germany and European history, but of the world more generally. Those skills are brought to bear in Crashed, a work that, for now at least, is a definitive account of the most important, arguably the most important event of our lifetimes. All right. Moderating tonight will be Atossa Araxia, author of The Cosmopolites, Coming of the Global Citizen, fantastic book that examines the sort of twin problems of people who, in the modern world, some of whom, partly because they have too much money, also have too much citizenship, other of whom, because they have too little money, don't have enough citizenship. With that, all right, that's the shilling for their wonderful books portion of the evening. Now I'd like to shill for my wonderful magazine. Dissent subscriptions are available over here if you sign at the table. If you sign up, there will also be a discount on all of the books that are here tonight. We also have swag, tote bag, and other stuff. That will be very much worth your time. Okay, and with that, I'd like to hand it over to Atossa.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm really glad we had such a good turnout, and I'm so happy to be here with these two brilliant authors. So Quinn's book, as you all may know, is about neoliberalism, before it was really known as such. It's a really, really fascinating book that will make you rethink all of those lazy uses of the term neoliberalism. Just to get an idea, how many people know what it means? How many of you are truly confident that you could define neoliberalism? Like 4 people.
All dudes.
This is why his book is essential. And Adam's book is also an expansive and a really definitive look at the effects and the after effects of the economic crisis, which started almost 10 years ago to the date. And the great thing about Adam's book is that it's not a US-centric book. It really looks at the crisis from many different perspectives from all over the world, and it goes into great detail, both technical and political. So very happy to have him here. I'm going to start this discussion by asking each of them what people misunderstand most deeply about their respective areas of expertise. So Quinn, what is neoliberalism, and what do people not understand about it? What's the most common misconception about it?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation, and thank you all for being here. Neoliberalism is a rascally word, but so are a lot of the words in the English language, and most of the words in the English language that we have competing definitions for, we don't sort of make decisions to banish from popular usage. So there must be some reason why people, periodically argue that neoliberalism should be purged from the scholarly vocabulary, right? That it just somehow should be crossed out. And I think that the problem is, of course, not with the word itself, but the way that it can act as a container of a lot of kind of sloppy thinking, right? And it ends up gathering together a lot of things that actually mean different things. So our task, I think, is not to sort of pass judgment on whether or not this should enter the dictionary, but sort of be more precise about what we mean when we use the term. And I think so far it's been used in 3 more or less incompatible ways. One, neoliberalism is used to refer to an era or a period of time from roughly the early 1970s to the present, the end of the Bretton Woods era, eventually the rise of the Washington Consensus, an era in which we are told we are encouraged more and more to act as entrepreneurs of ourself. Capital overcomes any level of national sovereignty, and national policy ends up being determined by something called the global economy. So that is a kind of a periodization argument about neoliberalism. Another way of using it is as a kind of rationality or a logic. So we, despite ourselves, have all been colonized by the way that neoliberalism makes us see ourselves as kind of containers of value that we speculate on and attempt to maximize the value of through various forms of self-management and posturing in everyday life. And a third definition is neoliberalism as a relatively discrete intellectual movement, really as an ideology associated with a somewhat small group of people, beginning with the people who coined the term in 1938 in a gathering in Paris called the Walter Lippmann Colloquium. These people are, some of them famous, some of them not so famous, include Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, Wilhelm Röpke, Louis Baudin. And this is a set of conversations that has been produced over the last near century in conversation with other competing ideologies, the ideas of social democracy, the ideas of Keynesianism. Neoliberalism has been a kind of evolving set of conversations about how to protect democracy against, how to protect capitalism against the threats of democracy. And this is, I think, allows us, if we see neoliberalism not as an all-encompassing, all-swallowing ideology, nor as simply a form of periodizing the world since the 1970s, rather, we see neoliberalism as a discrete set of conversations about organizing capitalism since the 1930s, really, then we can see neoliberalism as a kind of a form of regulating capitalism rather than the radical other of regulation of capitalism, and see it as a competing form of capitalism among others. So my book, I think, attempts to do that by talking about neoliberalism as an evolving ideology from really the end of the Habsburg Empire in the 1910s and 20s up until the creation of the WTO in the 1990s, in which you have a small set of thinkers who are trying to conceive of a logic of capitalism at the global level in competition with other things. So I think this is the best way we can kind of work with neoliberalism, is by kind of bringing it down to earth as a competing ideology among others, rather than a kind of all-subsuming or all-consuming morass into which we've all fallen and can now no longer escape.
Yeah, so we civilians outside the academy sort of became very aware of this term after the crisis, and I'm wondering if there's anything that happened during the crisis, after the crisis, and the way that it unfolded that made people more aware of this, and what is it about the crisis that we're not totally grasping even today?
I actually, the book evolved out of a course that I taught at Yale and Columbia over the period from 2013, and I did it in successive iterations. And there was one iteration of the course which was in fact about the crisis of 2008 as the terminal crisis of neoliberalism. That isn't the book that emerged, and I don't use the term in the book other than as a native term of the period, because as you say, Atossa, it becomes a key term of the period. And I think it's in the sense of I think we need, people sense that they need to encapsulate what this shock means. What has it damaged? What has it destroyed? And there's a story about the legitimacy of elites and how that then gives rise to populism. That's something I'm pushed on a lot. And I think another way of framing it would be to say that it destroys certain of the absolutely basic preoccupations of the neoliberals, as Quinn describes them so brilliantly, which is to neutralize the economy, to place it outside the realm of the political. And one of the things you have to do that is you've got to construct the economy as you brilliantly describe it, as a sort of an object which is, I think you use the word sublime, like, so you can get so close but not too close because it's like a volcano, it'll burn you if you get any closer. Or like the sun, if you look at it, you'll be blinded. Or Medusa, if you look at her, you'll be turned to stone. And you'll become something bad in the process of actually witnessing it. And the crisis doesn't allow us that luxury, right? One of the shocks of the crisis, which my book is about, is the way in which we actually, it's kind of the moment when economics encounters capitalism. And it's quite a shock, and it's a destabilizing shock, because economics, as it's practiced, sits obliquely in relation to neoliberalism, as you also describe in the book, because economics has to know a little bit more about the economy than the neoliberals are comfortable with. But it only has to know just enough. And what the crisis does is to expose huge areas, notably the balance sheet of giant banks, that you really have to know about. But and that's very destabilizing politically, because all of a sudden we're basically in the business of regulating the top 30 global banks. And that's a catastrophe from the point of view of the neoliberal project. And so that was one way of telling this story, because it's a sort of almost a neo-feudal conception of the economy. There are big barons, and you need to regulate those big barons. So any pretense of a kind of equal treatment of this systemic zone created by, in a law-like constitutional fashion, all of that goes out of the window. It becomes a politics of pure discretion. It's almost Clausewitzian, like almost military, tactical in its conception of how politics has to operate. It's about force and impact and coup d'oeil, being able to size up the moment and do the right thing at the right time. And so in all of those ways, it totally disrupts, I think, the neoliberal paradigm. And you could see the drama of the relationship between the Europeans and the Americans in these terms. I mean, Schäuble is a classic ordo-liberal, or at least clinging to his ordo-liberalism, the German finance minister, looking for rules, looking for the constitution of the EU, the Eurozone. And Geithner is this. Well, his great inspiration is Colin Powell, America's post-Vietnam chief of staff, who has this vision of, maximum. It's a Napoleonic conception of economic policy, maximum force at the critical point. However, that happens to be defined. So it's the opposite of what any neoliberal could conceive. That same question put to my topic would yield a slightly different answer, however, because out there in the world, when you pitch a book like this, the question I keep getting, which is the one which really reveals, and it's a different way of thinking about the economy, rather than as a constitution or as an object of technocratic intervention or a battlefield in which you have to intervene. Another way of thinking about the economy is as a sort of natural sphere. And the question I've been getting all the time, is, okay, so when are we going to have the next one? Because surely we're due another one. And it's like, it's a cyclical, natural conception of economic crisis. And that's absolutely not what 2008 is. 2008 really is a unique event so far in the history of global capitalism. There's never been anything quite like it in terms of the simultaneous implosion of the balance sheets of all of the major banks on both sides of the Atlantic, or the threat of that. And so, I mean, it's a bit like saying, so when is our next near-fatal heart attack coming along? It's not like, when are you going to have your next bout of bad flu? And of course, one could imagine a catastrophic scenario for the future in which that is our destiny. More and more risk of more and more absolutely fatal heart attacks. But for me, at that point, the natural analogy really breaks down and becomes uninterested. And what I'm interested in is telling a historical story about how a particular type of configuration of risks were assembled, and then asking the question of where the new types of risk might be.
Adam, you touched on something really interesting, and that's how much can we actually know about the economy? How much can business cycles tell us? Can we even create metaphors or imagery around the crisis? And the people that you wrote about in your book had some pretty interesting ways of explaining that, and they came to the conclusion that you can't really know the economy, or at least not on a global scale. What's up with that? Were they just really bad at math? Were they limited in their imagination? What was behind this thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it starts in the 1930s, which is really the period in which business cycle research takes off. So this idea that the 1920s and the 1930s, this idea that you could, through the use of mathematics, often by trained physicists are involved here, create some kind of a working model of how the economy might work. And this is usually being done, or is paradigmatically being done, in the 1920s and 30s at the scale of the nation. So when you think about Keynesian economics, you should think about this idea that the national economy is the kind of object of management that can be quantified, that can be understood through mathematics at some level. And the problem, the way that the neoliberals saw it at that moment, was that this way of seeing the economy was being used for projects really of redistribution at some level, often for left-leaning projects, tending towards something that they saw as a slippery slope towards socialism. So if you can see the economy, then you can plan it, right? If you can kind of model it, then you can tweak it and make it work out better for everyone. And the fear of people like Hayek was that this was a kind of seductive hubris, and that taken too far or almost immediately, it would actually break the mechanism itself. So in the 1930s, there was a kind of a moment of giving up on numbers and giving up on statistics and moving more towards the idea of binding laws as the fundamental way to organize the economy. And it's actually really interesting the way that Adam brings up the European-American contrast in the management of the fallout of 2008, because I think you're really right that what you see is that it betrays the fact that the people working in the central banks and in the United States were not neoliberals in the way that I'm describing them. They did not sort of see themselves as adherents of an Hayekian philosophy, et cetera. I mean, they were really trained in forms of Keynesianism, right? I mean, and they betrayed that in the way that they operated in a flexible way, seeing policy as something that is pragmatic and needs to be understood situationally, the way that you've recently described Jeff Mann's book on Keynes. And that ended up being, the patient didn't die, for what it's worth. Whereas the European model was, in fact, much more informed in the case of the German finance ministry by a belief that there are first principles that cannot be contravened and sort of damn the consequences, producing a situation in which Yanis Varoufakis describes, in which he's going to speak to the Eurozone ministers and he's explaining away and showing them charts and statistics and graphs about what this is going to do to the Greek economy. And they simply aren't interested even in pretending to be prone to the model of persuasion that he knows from the academic seminar room, that the practice of economic rule in the European Union has become simply brute assertion. A brute assertion of sovereignty against the periphery. So that is actually a very pure model of the kind of Hayekian neoliberalism that comes out of the 1930s and then gets kind of refined, especially by second generation Hayekian ordoliberals in West Germany, which is this belief that, yes, the economy is this kind of Augustinian mosaic, and it's much larger than we can ever possibly see, so we must simply trust the rules. But also, those rules will not enforce themselves, so there will always be the moment at which sovereignty will have to assert itself, the decision will have to come, and that will happen always sort of at the expense of those who are less well off.
I mean, having articulated that difference between the Europeans and the Americans in terms of this difference between Keynesians and neoliberals, I'd like to add a kind of a third element, which for me is really the radical breakthrough of the crisis, which is that within the pragmatic, instrumental policy-making world that the Americans inhabit, and so do many other central bankers in Europe as well.
Of course, yeah.
The German finance ministry, I think, is a peculiar institution.
Alone, yeah.
There is a further break, and the break really is precisely in the frame of the national economy as the relevant unit for understanding the way in which the modern economy works. And this is what I meant earlier by saying that this is the moment where capitalism catches up with economics. Because what becomes evident in 2008 is that you simply can't even get to first base in understanding the dynamic of the financial crisis if you start with the Keynesian national economic aggregates, because they don't predict the crisis where it happens. They would predict a crisis where it doesn't happen, which is in the relationship with China on the balance, in the massively imbalanced current account, which America still has with China and is now producing perhaps a trade war, but not the financial crisis of 2008. The crisis happens where really, skeptical analysts of globalization since the 1970s have said that the basic logic of globalization lies namely in the interaction between the balance sheets of major transnational corporations. And that, I think, has been the really so far, I mean, we haven't digested it yet in political terms, but the consequence of the crisis is that the pragmatic managers of the system have had to take on board a substantial element of the radical critique of that system, just so as to be able to manage it. The euphemisms that worked in the mid-century period that enabled you to do systemic management without actually dealing with the gubbins of capitalism fail in 2008. And they don't just fail on the financial side, because then all of a sudden you're going to have to do these filthy things. In the minds of people like Bernanke, filthy things, like bailing out Bear Stearns. That's a disgusting thing for somebody like him to have to do. Right. Geithner may relish the dirty hands problem, Bernanke doesn't. That for him is an illegitimate thing to have been forced to have to do, and he knows it deep in his heart. But that is what that moment demanded. And we see it in area after area. The current meeting, the meeting of the central bank elite at Jackson Hole this year was so telling precisely for this reason, because a bunch of macroeconomists sat around who do highbrow macro policy, which one has to understand as kind of the high church of policymaking, and they talked about the monopoly problem. That was the agenda. I mean, this is comparable to the kind of shifts that are happening in elite discourse in the United States in the late 19th century. A bunch of people who don't do micro, who don't do business, who don't talk to people in business schools, as a matter of taste and tact and who you are in the academic world. You have nothing to do with those people. They're not serious intellectually. And yet, without engaging with them, you can't address the inequality problem, you can't address the trade problem, you can't address, it turns out, the financial problem either, because all the problems are exactly where you can't address the tech problem, because that turns out to be in the accounts and the technologies of oligopolistic tech firms, which is what radicals have been saying really all along. The Frankfurt School said was busting the frame of liberalism back in the interwar period. It's now happening before our eyes. When Jackson Hole has this discussion of microeconomics, something very peculiar is happening in the elite culture of economic management in the US. And it's suffusing across the Atlantic, because a lot of the impulse is actually coming out of the BIS. This again, one of the holies of holies of central bank elite interaction. So I think we should not, in the spirit of a kind of call it Marxist if you like, but in the spirit of a realistic appreciation of what's going on in the elite management of capitalism at this moment, we should not underestimate the radicalism of these challenges in these shifts and their political potential. Because we now know more about the balance sheets of the biggest banks in the world than we have ever known before, and we know it with the power of the state, effectively, mobilized, and it's not the neutral state, this is the capitalist's own state, mobilized to produce this information.
Can I just say something quickly to that? I mean, I think that you're right, and you're right also that the left has not caught up to these insights, right? The left is still chasing Jackson Hole in that sense. And I think that what I mean by that is that I think one of the values of looking back at the way that neoliberals have thought the world order since the 1920s is to see that actually they remain pretty trapped in a kind of a national, international framework. Yeah. So their assumption is always that, it is either a question of national sovereignty or a kind of a global economic governance, which produces this either or option for politics. And I think the left reaction to 2008 in many cases has been to sort of reject the global and then re-embrace the national. But that would be to fall into the trap of the categories that they've set for us in the first place, which is something we should avoid doing. And then also to not keep track or keep up with the way that capitalism itself has changed. So the fact of this sort of the intranational and the transnational force of financial balance sheet transactions of the kind that you've described is something that I feel like is not being even approached to being theorized into these attempts at building left populist movements, for example, which are using very much like a mid-century kind of Keynesian analysis as if all there is either the national or the supranational.
And it was out of date in the 70s already.
And we were going backwards. I mean, so I studied Germany, and it's unbelievable that you have someone like Sarah Wagenknecht, who was the left party leader, who was speaking in front of Blockupy in 2015, trying to get a hold of financialization as a problem that the left has to understand, whereas she in 2018 is talking about the need for closed borders and preaching against the rights of migrants and refugees to enter, defaulting to this national-international dichotomy, or national globalist, even worse dichotomy, that I feel like, this is where actually a lot of just the explanation of how things work that we get in your book is sort of essential for a starting point for politics.
But so what's emerging here is a realization, whether it's in Jackson Hole or at Occupy Wall Street, that there's, different versions of sovereignty. There's national sovereignty, there's European sovereignty, there's this sort of globalist system that, acts like a sovereign. And then you have this sovereignty that's emerging from the private sector. There's a paper recently called Digital Switzerland's about how the tech companies think, basically act like sovereign states. And I think that that's actually quite apt. Is there a danger that this kind of sovereignty is going to be legitimized as a result of trying to get out of the binary of national versus international? And is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Where does that put the left?
Well, when it comes to a lot of the things that I read about in my book, like international investment law or trade treaties like GATT and later WTO, these are often narrated by the left. You think about someone like Wolfgang Schreck as a giving up of sovereignty by the national government upwards to some kind of a supranational or a third-party entity. International economic lawyers, by contrast, look at that and they say that's wrong. These are democratically elected governments, therefore they are sovereign, and when they make the decision to give their sovereignty upwards, then this is sort of a sharing of sovereignty rather than a relinquishing or a surrender of sovereignty. And although I think that the way that the sharing of sovereignty upward has functioned so far has been mostly negative for progressive causes and causes of social justice as we have them now, I think it's a mistake to simply look at this situation once again and fall into that false dichotomy and say, therefore, all we need to do is regain sovereignty at the national level, and we will have somehow solved the problem. I mean, it's not clear why that would be the case. Instead, I think we can think with and against people like these international economic lawyers, which is to say, why can't you think about sharing sovereignty upward, but in ways that act in the pursuit of political goals that you might actually believe in? And one of the fascinating and terrifying, as many of the things are that are happening these days, things about Trump's trade policy is you look at someone like Robert Lighthizer, Trump's U.S. trade representative, and one of the things that he managed to get through the agreement with Mexico was raising the wages of auto workers, right? And you can look at that in a number of ways, but one of the things that should be striking from that is that under a different regime attached to a different set of policies, this might actually be something that the left might want to be supporting. Of course, it's paired with other things that makes you wonder whether or not it's a cynical scheme just to win back American competitiveness, but I think that we need to think about that space of sovereignty between the nation and supranational as a space that can be turned, to our advantage, so to speak, rather than one that simply needs to be abandoned tout court because it's a kind of tainted zone and the only space of justice is the nation.
But I mean, I think, much as I agree with what Quinn's just said, it seems to me unhelpful to argue about this question of sovereignty in the abstract from the system of international relations and of international power into which sovereignties are inserted and have always been inserted. And so there is really a question here of identities and positionality that's absolutely crucial to consider. And it's a very different matter to be having this conversation in the United States, in the extraordinarily lopsided circumstances of North America, when the United States can bully Mexico and Canada into whatever arrangements they're willing to concede. From the position that America occupies in the world system, than it is to have that conversation, say, in the UK or Greece or Spain or anywhere else, right, in the global system which doesn't occupy America's position. So I think that, for me, is also an irreducible continuity of my work over recent books, has been, it's essentially a Trotskyite type of insight into the need to understand uneven and combined development. We simply cannot discuss these issues meaningfully without understanding the position of the entities that we're talking about in this power system. And the United States and the United States left undoubtedly does have an extraordinarily position of privilege within this system. And that makes, undeniably, and it may even, without going to the normative level, it simply makes certain sorts of national strategy realistic in the United States, in the way that they are absolutely not for Greece, or I would argue and insist, the United Kingdom. And furthermore, from a normative point of view, the kind of political trade-offs you engage in the United States may be less toxic, therefore, than they are, for instance, in the United Kingdom. So that, I think, for me, is a crucial part of this conversation, and also of the history of 2008, that we have to, we cannot take this element of power and hierarchy out of the question, and to think about sovereignty as essentially a general property, is it's the great hypocrisy of the entire concept. It's an absurd concept. And really the question is, how is that power system morphing over time? Are we morphing towards out of a unipolar moment into a multipolar moment, a bipolar moment, some kind of anarchic situation? All of these questions have to be posed, can only be posed intelligently against the backdrop of some set of assumptions about that broader picture. And America, again, from the point of view of that broader picture, is in this privileged position of knowing whichever way this goes down, it's not the kind of catastrophe that it could be for a Greece or a United Kingdom, let alone an emerging market like Turkey or Argentina.
So this completely uneven balance of power with the U.S. in a position of much more power than Turkey or Greece makes me wonder if the people who came up with the idea of a system like this in the first place, what would they think? I mean, what would your characters think of the world we live in today? Would they approve of the global economic order we have? Would they nitpick? What grade would they give it?
Who's on the grading committee here?
I mean, I think that the world since... So I think, my book ends basically with the creation of the WTO in 1995. And I think that was a point that was kind of the culminating point of a particular understanding of what neoliberalism could look like at the global level or the supranational level. And it was, the WTO can be understood in different ways, but one way of understanding it is as a kind of a solution, not an ideal solution, but a solution to precisely the kind of imbalance of power that you just described, right? The fact that if you were a small country, you were a Morocco, you were a Botswana, you were a Tunisia, you had no chance against the rule of force and the sovereigntist approach to global trade that the Reagan administration was using in the 1980s. And so to sign on to something like a reformed GATT and to the WTO was your way of salvaging sovereignty within some form of supranational governance. So I think that there are ways that, the more fair-minded, ordoliberal folks like Ernst Ulrich Petersmann, who I write about in the book, who was part of the transformation of the GATT, the WTO, they saw that as being a kind of a humane model that had locked in certain rules with enforcement mechanisms that would not lead to global equality, and that was never the intention, but they would lead at least to some kind of consistency and an equality before the law that would be the best we can do, let's say. Because actually neoliberalism is a very pessimistic ideology, the way I see it. I mean, it's always kind of the ideology of the lesser evil. This is the model that will not at least lead to the destruction of humanity. I mean, when Hayek talks about the need to preserve the free market mechanism, he says if we disrupt it, millions of people will die. I mean, he literally uses kind of the specter of mass death to blackmail us into preserving the status quo. And he's not the only one to do that. So that moment, 1995, was of course sullied very quickly by the WTO protests, which indirectly led to a legitimacy crisis of the WTO. The way that China and India have been using the WTO and has been, the target of much American criticism even before Trump, right? Don't forget that Obama actually blocked an appointment of a judge to the appellate body before Trump did. So this isn't exactly only a Trump story. But since Trump, these very order liberals are very upset, right? I mean, they think that this multilateral governance model, with all its shortcomings, is now being torn up root and branch. So the world that they're seeing, they're not assessing according to levels of global inequality or how many people live on $1 a day in the world or any of these sort of indicators. They're simply looking at it from the kind of the perspective of the moon looking back at the earth saying, what is the state of the multilateral rules order? The state is bad, right? Yeah. So that is kind of the scale at which they tend to assess success or failure. And right now it doesn't look good. But because isonomy, the kind of goal of the same law that circles the earth, is being disrupted by the arbitrary interventions of spontaneous tariff declarations and so on. So in my understanding, the way that Trump is operating right now is not neoliberal, because he has forsaken the kind of cardinal rule of neoliberalism, which is the economy is a depoliticized space. It never functions that way in practice, but rhetorically it must remain pure of the intervention of the disruption of politics. And Trump has brought politics rushing back into the space of economics. And I think that's part of the delirium or the kind of disorientation that a lot of people are feeling on the left, is like, we've been trying to politicize the economy for decades, and now it's happened, but not by us, by someone who we generally despise. And so is this a situation that can be turned around or flipped in some kind of a judo move, or have we simply been outflanked and done for good?
You mentioned the WTO, and that reminds me of when it was established in the 90s, shortly after, there were enormous protests from the left against their version of globalization. Now when we think of anti-globalization, we think of Steve Bannon, we think of this thinly veiled racism and xenophobia, but there was an inflection point in the late 90s when anti-globalization meant we don't like sweatshops, and we would prefer to live in a world without too much exploitation, and like maybe Nike should pay people better. How did we get here? Because this is a very different, is there any continuity between this alter-globalization that the left was talking about, around the Seattle protests around the WTO, and what we're seeing today, which is this very right-wing, racist version of it?
Do you want to handle that?
I don't know, I'm not even sure I quite buy the story of the. I'm not happy with the generalizations about the sort of the populist phenomenon.
I'm a journalist, not
yeah. No. It's not a. It's and one of the things that makes me a little bit squeamish about it is that it doesn't seem to me that they do neatly line up as anti-globalization forces, and in exactly the way that Quinn's been elucidating. Many of them are really about just altering the way in which they relate to globalization. And crucially, and this goes back to my point about power, the argument from the American side is simply we could have our way much more often if we threw our weight around a little bit more blatantly. And that's quite difficult for certain sorts of left politics also to disagree with, because they actually do buy the China shock story as a major part of the element of why inequality has increased, though it's hotly disputed by the econometric evidence, but nevertheless, that's quite deeply built in, all the way back to the NAFTA argument. And so this argument that by gaining purchase and leverage can in fact redress domestic inequality, and that should be your primary focus. Also just for tactical reasons, that without doing that, you can't make any positive change, and then America can't be people. That has real leverage. And the same is true for the Brexit people. Whatever problems one may have with them, their politics is anti-European, not anti-globalist. They have all these crazy fantasies which go back to precisely the problems of the post-imperial period that Quinn makes the center of his story about neoliberalism, about how the moment, the day of the Brexit referendum is the moment when global Britain started to re-emerge. It's a kind of a ludicrous fantasy. And linked to various fantasies also of kind of leverage. It's like a Cold War model that somehow they could sit between the blocks and mediate, and they'd be China's. But then you do have, if you look at the opinion polling of people who vote for the Front National or the AfD, they do seem to be anxious Europeans who are stressed about globalization, and their politics does seem to line up in that way. And so I think, this is a kind of, it's actually, it's not a straightforward line at all. And I do think, I like the way in which your notes for us, we do clearly have to distinguish kind of an alter-globalization movement from an anti-globalization movement to do justice to those protests. I actually did sit with a bunch of neoliberals on Tuesday and talked about it. I was laughing when you said, how would they rate the state of the world? Because they literally rated it. It was hilarious. They had first best, second best.
B-minus?
Yeah, no,
it got second to third best rating. And there was a first best world, and the first best world was the one that Quinn was describing, which was the 1990s. But their story ended not with Trump, but in 2000, 2001, 2002. So with the failure of the Doha round of WTO, with the George Bush presidency, with the crumbling, really, of strong, hard climate politics and the move towards much more weak models. Their narrative was that it had already broken then. So the entire 2000s period, and it wasn't to do, with all due respect, it wasn't to do with anti-globalization politics. It was simply that the nation-state interest had dominated, that the developing world and the advanced world couldn't come to terms on agriculture. The sorts of things which you actually discussed brilliantly in your book.
Well, the fragile consensus had broken down, and China had started to
To emerge as a-
accelerate by that time. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with both of you in seeing the far right as an alter globalization rather than an anti-globalization. I mean, the tendency to narrate it in the mainstream media and sort of op-eds has been kind of, the revolt against the open society or the revolt against globalization and the turn inward, the turn to a closed society. Withdrawal, isolation are the kind of verbs that we tend to see. But if you look at the people who were behind the far-right movements in Western Europe anyway, I mean, this is far from the vision that they had, right? I mean, the motivation of people to start something like the AfD, the Alternative for Germany party, was to break with the euro because they felt like it was turning into a socialist transfer union, and they needed to re-enter the global economy because Germany was dominant enough to do its own, they would do much better with its own currency. If you look at the people who now claim to be the intellectual origin of Brexit, someone like the Bruges Group, or if they're following on from right-wing Tory conversations connected to Margaret Thatcher in the late 1980s, which is to say, we have not rolled back the borders of the state at home, only to see them rolled out at a much higher level in Brussels. So their vision is pivoting the British economy, as Adam is saying, from a European focus back to a global focus.
And that tension goes all the way back to the 1950s. I mean, the narrative which developed during the crisis of the EU and the Eurozone as the master code being basically Hayekian is convincing up to a point. But what it ignores is that, in fact, in the 1950s, there were knock-down, drag-out fights, especially on the German side, precisely about this question of whether a privileged relationship with France was the way to go, or whether that, in fact, marked a profound and dangerous step back from global ambition, which would have been much more like Germany before 1914, which had huge trading and in kind of informal empire in Latin America and Australia and Asia and so on. And so the narrowing of the tracking of German internationalization towards Europe is anything but evident, right? There's many different ways of mapping that market-based and neoliberal project onto a geography.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I talk about in the book is this wonderful footnote of the Treaty of Rome, the Banana Protocol, which was added on to the creation of the European Economic Community because the Germans wanted to keep getting bananas from Latin America, which is where they always got them. They didn't want to buy these protected bananas from the British Caribbean or Italian, former Italian Somaliland. So Germany was always pushing for the opening up of the European market, actually, rather than pushing for a kind of fortress model from a trade point of view. But I wanted to say, though, quickly on the question of the origins of populism, right? There's sort of like the search is on for the definitive hot take on where this all started and where it came from. And I think every time there's a generalization, it runs into the same problem, which is the problem that populism scholars like Kasmuda describe as the supply side versus the demand side problem, right? So the people who start these movements are often the kind of people we're talking about, sort of dissident neoliberals, unhappy with the European Union, unhappy with NAFTA, seeking a kind of a more sovereigntist pivot more towards a global competitive market. But then they're sort of alter globalizers, but even kind of hyper globalizers sometimes. But then the people who end up being drawn to their parties often are of quite different temperament, right? So almost always you can see this story of beginning with more kind of purist neoliberal positions in the far-right parties, and then as they see how successful anti-migrant and xenophobic and Islamophobic messages are at the polls, beginning to figure out how those can be grafted on to the pre-existing kind of market-friendly policies that they've already established. So you see that kind of takeover from the voters by the voters sort of taking over the original ideologues in many cases. And I think that often the people who are trying to understand the origins of populism have chosen one or the other and then produced this kind of, incoherent picture, because you can always simply point out, no, you're missing the intentions of the creators, no, you're missing the motivations of the voters. So I think we need to be sort of mindful of that and not see kind of like the pithiest way of understanding what's happening.
This seems like a good time to talk about borders and how borders fit into the neoliberal imaginary. I personally always find myself trying to find some sort of consistency or logic or sort of, thread through which you can, if you're advocating for free trade, then, logically you should also be interested in freedom of movement. But that's never really how it works. And I thought your book did such a good job of explaining to me, and anyone else who's asking these questions, why it is that you can have one and not the other, and how this came about and how this fits into the worldview. Can you tell us a bit about how the neoliberalism saw borders and how their conversations are playing out even today?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of one of the shadow narratives of the 20th century for neoliberals that I touch on in the book, but I don't really focus on as much as now I think I probably should have, which is the kind of vanishing of the free movement of labor as part of the neoliberal imagination. So if you go back to the 1920s and you read what Mises is saying, for example, his vision is of total labor mobility and actually of nations as these sort of mobile things that can reform. They could, a bunch of people from one language community could move to Latin America and reform there. They could move, they would eventually, melt away in their indigenous homeland. So he had no connection between sort of ethnicity, language, and territory in the sort of traditional Wilsonian sense. He had this very interesting kind of amoeba-like Habsburg imaginary where, a multinational space could kind of persist by no one having a claim on any one part of territory. But what really happens is the Second World War to this neoliberal imaginary. So in the 30s, someone like Haberler, who I talk about, and Mises himself, they start to say, well, freedom of movement has been de facto disrupted by the existence of a world war. And we can't expect, Mises says, you can't expect the United States to let in, for example, Germans and Japanese people in the early 1940s. It would be bringing in a fifth column. So can I defend a model of an open world economy without free migration? And Haberler, for one, ends up coming up with something called the theory of comparative costs, which is often still cited in international trade today, which argues that if you have enough goods and capital moving, then you don't need labor going over borders in order to have all the benefits of an open world economy. And over time, this thing that started out as a kind of a concession to the imperfection of humans and the imperfection of political reality, then gets kind of recuperated as a necessity for a functioning world economy. So by the 1980s, Hayek is starting to say, actually, maybe you need a certain set of hereditary values and traditions within a given community to persist as a good acting free market liberal community. He's inspired in part by the reaction against the influx of immigrants from the British Empire, from South Asia, from East Africa. Thatcher comes down strong against the immigrants in the late 1970s, and Hayek comes to her defense in the Sunday Times in a series of editorials saying, she's right, I was in Vienna in the 1920s, we had an influx of Jews from the East, it disrupted everyday life, it disrupted market activity, one needs actually a kind of critical mass of people, of like-minded, homogeneous people for capitalism to persist. So that the barrier, the migration barrier, which was originally a kind of a provisional concession to the imperfection of capitalism, then by the 80s and 90s for a lot of sort of conservative neoliberals becomes a precondition for the functioning free market. And that's where you get a lot of these far-right parties I've been describing are both simultaneously globalist in their embrace of free movements of trade and goods, but restrictionist in the kinds of immigration that can be allowed into the country. And that actually isn't only a kind of tactical sop to voters. It actually has, for what it's worth, an internal coherence within their own writings in places like Ordo Journal and so on.
I mean, writing about the 2008 crisis and facing this, as you nicely put it, the search for the answer to the populism question. Part of the problem is 2015. So intellectually, part of the problem is 2015, because how do you disentangle and relate these two shocks? Because the AfD comes into existence crisply and clearly as an anti-Draghi Eurozone protest party. And then, as you described it, morphs into this xenophobic, anti-Islamic party. And that isn't just, as it were, the result of canny entrepreneurship. It's also the result of this opportunity that presents itself with the Syrian crisis. So for me, thinking about this concretely rather than in the abstract, the question is, where does the Syrian crisis stand in relation to the problem of 2008, right? So if we have a genesis of populism or a genesis of protest politics coming out of the financial crisis, And an awful lot of the subsequent analysis has impaled itself on this dilemma of saying, well, there are two factors and they're radically separate from each other, and one is economics and the other one is race, or some version of race. And never the two shall meet fundamentally, right? They're analytically separate, and you commit a crime against either one code by incorporating the other into your analysis, right? You commit a crime against the kind of materialist code if you incorporate race and take it seriously, and you commit a crime against the fundamental importance of race in modern politics if you insist that, in fact, it's economic disadvantage that's doing the damage. And for me, it was a real struggle analytically also how we tell this story. I just don't know, I couldn't in the end resolve this problem as to how you write a book which does justice to this double shock, other than to treat it as simply additive. How do you analytically incorporate it? And with regard to something like North America, that's relatively straightforward, I think, because you can tell the long history of migrant Mexican labor to the United States, and you can tell, of course, the history, and there's an incredibly sophisticated literature about anti-black racism, slavery, and capitalism in the United States. And so you can build those things into an analytical account of our current moment. Trump adds those things and then adds anti-Islamic xenophobia on top, and then you've got the cocktail. And in Europe, I think we still struggle really to think about this problem, and yet it is fundamental to European history, and it is the Mediterranean, and it is the fault line with Islam, and it is Austria, and it is Turkey, and it's all actually there, but it really is a problem. And for me personally, I don't do this in the book, and I did write a chapter about Turkey specifically so as to be able to incorporate Syria and the refugee crisis, and then couldn't make it work in a narrative way or in a causal way that satisfied me. And yet, in a sense, what we're doing at that moment is replicating the failure of the EU's political and economic policy with regard to its immediate neighborhood. Right? It was easier for me to integrate the East European story into a story of imperialism and its tensions and the clash with Russia over Ukraine than it was for me to incorporate the Eastern Mediterranean, which in fact, in political terms, has had much more explosive impacts on European politics. So what I'm trying to get at is we actually still struggle as a matter of politics and of analysis to make these links and to escape this fatal dichotomization, which then results in saying, well, the AfD is one rather than the other. I mean, there's a huge argument going on in Germany right now between different wings of Die Linke about how far Wagenknecht is justified in making the move that she is on the basis of sociological analyses of a SOEP panel study of data of people who voted AfD precisely on the horns of this dilemma. Right, so this is an analytical dilemma, it's a narrative dilemma, it's a practical political dilemma in which the Europeans are really undertooled right now. And I will plead guilty to having, failed to really make any progress on that problem myself, though it was glaring. You couldn't finish this book after 15 without recognizing the scale of this practical, intellectual, and political problem.
Well, it's definitely one of the uncanny things about the current moment for people who live in the United States and work on Europe. I mean, to hear the rhetoric of open borders being thrown around in the United States is, of course, absurd. Because the story in the United States, I think, is actually much cleaner, right? This is the story that Wendy Brown tells in Walled States, Waning Sovereignty, which is, the moment of freeing trade is precisely aligned with the moment of pouring more and more resources into blocking human mobility and human migration. So the mid-1990s is both the time of NAFTA and the WTO and the time of the first stretch of wall being built along the stretch of the US-Mexico border. So there it's quite clear. I mean, if you want to talk about free movement for goods and capital, but not for humans, this is what we have actually in the United States, and Trump didn't invent it. It's been there all along, but in a pronounced and obvious way since the mid-1990s. Whereas the European Union, I mean, I think it's only now the radical nature of the experiment that was undertaken in the European Union to actually remove the border posts, right? To remove borders throughout the Schengen area in Europe. I mean, it was done in all of the ways that people describe the way European integration has worked, sort of falling forward, the failing forward. But the kind of speculation on how that might affect political alignments was not done in advance, and there wasn't enough preparation for what that might produce as far as new conundrums. And so having simultaneously genuinely free capital movement within the Eurozone, and genuinely free human movement within the Schengen area has, as you say, kind of produced this apparently mutually exclusive choice for people on the left, and Sarah Wagenknecht is a perfect example of this, where you either focus on the free movement for people or you focus on the free movement for capital.
It's more extreme, because it isn't the movement within the Schengen zone that's the problem. It's the fact that Europe's southern neighbor is not Mexico, but North Africa, and then beyond that, sub-Saharan Africa. That is the fundamental, and then mediated by the great historical divide between Christianity and Islam, for which Turkey stands, which the Christian Democrats had taught, basically backed themselves into a corner onto already by 2007. So to my mind, Europe is a much, much more contorted and twisted version of this problem, and the stakes are so much higher given the demographic future that lies ahead over the next 50 years when you contrast sub-Saharan Africa with that of Central America. So, but I really think this is it's obviously it's the fundamental problem of Europe in the present, and yet it's being sort of parceled off into this zone in which culture and race sit separate from economics, and that's a bankruptcy essentially of analysis, if that's where we allow it to reside, also as a matter of tactics.
Yeah, well, money doesn't have a race or a religion or an ethnicity or a culture, and it continues to move rather freely, I think. Did the crisis change that? Did the crisis have an effect on capital mobility? Do we have fewer tax havens today than we did before? What is the status of it?
There have been some moves to tighten the tax haven story, but it's trivial in relation to the size of the problem. It remains a scandal of global proportions. And contrary to the self-positioning of the Europeans as victims of globalization, several European states, core European states, are key perpetrators in this. They are America's globalization problem, Ireland, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Likewise, of course, there are states within the Union of the United States, like Delaware and several of the desert states, which are pioneering new types of internal tax refuge. But if you actually look at global capital mobility, there are some very interesting patterns. In the course of the crisis, the flux of capital was so massive and so astonishing that the IMF, in fact, converted to a pragmatic willingness to accept capital controls for emerging markets that were receiving the overspill of quantitative easing. And what that's an indication of is quite what a historic departure quantitative easing was. I mean, when they made the rules of absolute capital mobility in the 1980s, no one imagined that there was going to be an American central banker who would triple the size of the Fed's balance sheet in a matter of years. That wasn't on anyone's horizons. And the consequence of that huge action by the American nation state, and then the Bank of Japan, the ECB, the Bank of England, Swiss National Bank as well, is to produce capital flows, which... This is the politicization of the economy that Quinn was gesturing to. It wasn't Trump, and that I was trying to say earlier with macro finance. The crisis produced a necessary and pragmatic opening, at least, towards the politicization of the economy that even the IMF couldn't be resistant to. And de facto, since the flows of capital are to such a large extent controlled by the balance sheets of the global megabanks, and the European megabanks suffered such a severe shock during the crisis, the volumes of capital flow across crucial nodes in the global system are substantially lower than they were before. And insofar as the left is interested in regulating capital flows in future, that's also where the pressure points are. We need to not think in terms of 1940s Bretton Woods type capital controls, where you have governments sitting around a table organized in alphabetical order and deciding on what they think and how they think money ought to move. The key players here are the private actors and the scale of their balance sheets. And so if you look now at the way, for instance, China manages its balance of payments, they have some elements of Bretton Woods style, limits on how much ordinary citizens can move in and out. The vast majority of it is done through what's called macroprudential regulation of their banking sector. So direct interventions of the balance sheets of the key big actors. You don't even pretend, you don't even start with the Keynesian presumption that it's national economies that matter. You go straight to the heart of the matter and try and tweak those balance sheets. Turkey will almost certainly be doing the same kind of thing behind the scenes right now. So there have been moves, and even quite dramatic moves. I mean, the conversion of the IMF is spectacular, but nothing on the nothing on the tax haven front. And the tax havens are, of course, crucial because they are the conduit for the bit that really matters, which is the profit. Right. You know, the other side of capital flow is about the gigantic gross flows, and then you skim a tiny fraction off each one of those transactions. And a lot of business can be done doing that, but the tax havens are the ultimate place where you pile the stuff up. And there has been relatively little movement.
I wanted to maybe just ask a slightly different question that, I don't know, probably we'll be opening up to questions and answers from the floor in a minute. But for me, I was thinking in preparation for this event why it was that you had asked two historians to be here, right? You know, what is it about the discipline of history that has to offer at this moment other than just a kind of a Vox-style explainers on, like, you know, where the crisis came from, right? Because I think that, you know, probably most of us are interested in something more than the people who are mostly interested in stuff like that are those who stand to make a lot of money. But I think that, you know, for me, reading Adam's book, which only quote unquote goes back 10 years and covers the whole globe, or my shorter book that goes farther and much thinner and a more narrow focus on trade governance, I mean, what you see in both cases is how the present is not necessary, right? There was nothing predetermined about us being in the place we're in now, right? Like the world we live in is been created by a series of rather contingent choices that could have gone other ways. Some of them much more abysmally catastrophic for all of us, others perhaps, you know, producing a world that we might like to live in more. And I think especially the further back you go, I mean, in my case, going back 100 years, you find these moments that are almost impossible to imagine right now. The 1970s, where the global South, you know, was threatening action in ways that actually scared Wall Street, that was frightening capitalists in the heart of the world economy, right? Because of their ability to cut off access to certain key commodities, not just oil, but others as well. So there's these ways in which we can kind of see how the balances of the world have actually been different at different points in time. And I feel like, at least for me, that's a really necessary kind of realization, right? That we are not just kind of staggering along to the next inevitable crisis when God help us, we have good elites this time, like we had good enough elites that we don't all, you know, perish. But there's a feeling of wanting to rediscover moments of openness. And I think that that's really what history, I would hope, has to offer at this moment. And so if we could expand on that, that would be great.
I mean, from my point of view, one of the things that two books do have in common, and this is something perhaps that a certain sort of history can produce, I mean, there's sort of the openness. I would push, I mean, like, my book doesn't describe a great deal of openness fundamentally, I don't think. But it does, at one level it does, and what the two books really have in common is they both describe kind of pris de conscience of a certain sort of moment of awareness, or a certain sort of moment of insight would be too, certainly I wouldn't want to concede it to your neoliberal folks, but a kind of the formation of a certain sort of conscious appreciation of how the economy does or doesn't work, some image of the economy. And that, I think, is something that we actually can help economists see about themselves some of the time. Certainly that's the way I think about my book, is that it actually, because it's making claims around a certain sort of economics which is new and produced by the crisis, but rather than just, as it were, stating that this is how we ought to analyze the crisis, it's claiming that in and of itself is a historic moment. So it's locating that thought and the breakthrough that thought represents in the moment out of which it was born. So in that sense, it is a kind of openness, though of course practically the story of the last 10 years is hardly one of radical opening, but rather really of a door which sort of maybe swung open and then was slammed pretty firmly shut.
Right, but kind of in the same way we talked about this alter globalization, even if it's come from the right, has had the effect of kind of repoliticizing spheres of the economy that were long seen as kind of natural and beyond the kind of the scope of policymakers or political decision makers. I mean, it's sort of this denaturalization of the economy is actually historically pretty new. I can speak to even teaching a class at the college where I teach for the last 10 years. 10 years ago, the idea that you could understand something about the economy if you weren't taking an economics class was something that my students generally didn't think would be the case. But now there is this realization that no, economics is political. It has to be. We've seen how it's gone down. And I think that doing the kind of middle ground explanatory work that you did is necessary, because even the kind of critical political economy that we had before would sort of argue that the present was necessary, in the sense that it would say that the way neoliberalism works is when there is a financial crisis, debt is socialized, the state steps in and pays back the banks, and we all suffer further. And what you show is there was nothing preordained about that outcome in the case of 2008 and what happened afterwards, right? There was some serious sweating happening in the centers of calculation and the centers of power, and there was heavy rhetoric that needed to be brought out to get Congress to go through on some things and not on others. So I think that even
politics that does the shutting down, it isn't the logic of the economy per se.
Right, exactly. So even if it is a constrained sort of field of maneuver, I think, any field of maneuver is kind of welcome to be mapped for us as terrain of intervention right now.
How are we doing on time?
Questions?
Questions? Okay, let's take some questions.
So, Adam, you were just talking about an image of consciousness of the economy popping up, and that takes me to... I'll repeat it. Adam, you were just talking about an image of consciousness sort of popping up, and consciousness of the economy. That takes me to, in your vivid review of Quinn's book, your point of gentle criticism about globalists being a new successor in a literature about intellectual logics. I read Quinn's book. I've been thinking about that point of yours. And actually, in thinking about Quinn's book, and right to what you just said, I think it's all showing me that these ideas do matter. Kind of like organizational sociologists in the neo-institutionalist vein would say that our imageries of what happens in organizations matter. And I wonder if between the two of you might address, where do you stand on ideas versus, as you in your dissent review said, what about the actual economics, the material flows and so forth, perhaps beneath the ideas? I mean, how does this shake out in how you're both thinking?
I think that what I was in part trying to get at, and let's just say, I thought Quinn's book was so good that it kind of posed the question of what next with incredible force, and that's where, insofar as it was a critique, that's where that came from. It's like, okay, what are we going to do now? Because we can't do any more of this, because this is kind of game, set, and match. And what I felt moved towards was to ask. I wouldn't make the distinction, if you like, between ideas and the real so much as the sort of thing that historians of science are interested in, or historians of statistics, the instruments of knowledge. Precisely the kind of things, in a sense, that the neoliberals want to ban us from employing. Because the fatwa they've declared, in fact, extends, as Quinn brilliantly describes, it creates this entirely split consciousness. Because if you take Hayek seriously, you can't do economics at all. And that clearly you do want to make real existing neoliberalism tick. And one of the things you're going to test it by is whether it delivers growth. And when you start doing that, then you actually have to get into the weeds and understand something about something you're not really supposed to be able to know anything about. Because if you do, then you're going to go down this terrible route and you'll end up as a social democrat. And that would be the worst thing that could possibly happen. And then everyone will die. We'll all die. We'll all die.
Millions will die.
Millions of people will die. So, and yet, of course, the other side of the story is they won't die because we're going to have growth and we'll escape Malthus. And so there's this profound tension, and that seems to me to be where in a sense, if we want to unearth neoliberalism also as a critical project, we need to go, which is why I'm so fascinated by these sort of mole-like figures inside the utterly most mainstream bits of the policy-making apparatus who are coming up with all this stuff which is completely subversive of the mega-framing that Quinn describes so beautifully, which requires all these separations and couldn't possibly acknowledge the role of the corporation. And so I wouldn't separate, these are all ideas and they're all stuff at the same time, but what I'm interested in is a different type of instrumentality, a different type of equipment, different places where thinking is happening. Because in his book he beautifully describes the early generations of business cycle researchers, and then he moves on to tell the story of the neoliberals. But the business cycle people go on doing their thing all the way down to the present. And it's those people that I've consistently followed through. So that would be my answer. It isn't an opposition between ideas and the real, so much as different toolkits, different structures, and a different set of layers, a different set of boundaries between what is conceptualized and what not. And that's where I kind of think there's a lot of wiggle room, and also the potential for very interesting politicization.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of things that you can go out and study, there's sort of the declared ideas and the declared principles, and then the undeclared ideas and undeclared principles. And the thing about declared principles when it comes to neoliberals is, as actually Adam wrote about in his recent review of Jeff Mann's book on Keynes, is they're constantly contravening their own rules, right? Yeah. I mean, so there's a kind of way in which neoliberalism is just kind of habitual hypocrisy, because it's always the claim of this constitutional divide between the world of property and the world of sovereignty, and nonetheless, all we see is transgressions of this. So there's that's one way of studying, what does it matter when people make certain declarations? I think in the case of neoliberalism, recent work, for example, by Stephanie Mudge, the sociologist, has shown that we see something by which the people who declare principles of, say, fiscal austerity or the need for balancing budgets tend not to be the ones who actually carry it out. And then, unfortunately, the story of the last 25 years is the so-called left parties becoming true believers in the hypocritical principles that the neoliberals have articulated, right? So then the people who actually balance the budgets tend to be and who actually practice sort of welfare retrenchment, and who actually start to shrink the social state, and the times of being in power end up being the formerly left or centrist left parties. So there's that question of kind of declared principles and how they get abused or misread or reappropriated. But then there's the question of undeclared principles, and there I think one can read the kind of people that populate Adam's books. I mean, central bankers are perfect, right? Because they have this kind of principle of never really saying what they mean, right? Like what Paul Volcker called the mystique of central banking, right? To sort of produce this sort of robot-like fog where people have to then, read the tea leaves, as they say. So there's a way that even when they're avoiding outright declarations of principle, nonetheless they are acting by some sets of guiding norms and behaviors. So then one can go in, and that's what I've been doing, for example, with Robert Lighthizer, who's not someone who writes a manifesto Hayek style, but who does act in a relatively consistent way, which, if read, with enough care, shows a kind of internal pattern or a logic of its own.
Completely different direction. So I was wondering, you mentioned this sort of national global dichotomy, and I perceive that there is a kind of conversation on the left on the question of what ought the strategy to look like going forward. And I feel like there's a risk, just as the left folded to the neoliberal center in the 90s, that we are seeing now the first moves of a nationalist version of vision, most usually associated with Wolfgang Streeck. So I was wondering what Adam and you think about that challenge.
Adam is on record saying what he thinks about Wolfgang Streeck. You just Google their names together and you'll get the back and forth in the LRB from a couple of years ago. And I don't know if he wants to revisit that. But, I mean, I think that my answer to your question, I'm going to give you a minute to decide. But
you go first, Quinn. That's fine. I'll think about it.
I think that, what we were talking about, the left is kind of still chasing Jackson Hole. I mean, it's actually remarkable that how much debt and finance were at the center of these conversations a minute ago, and they're not anymore, or not right now, right? And that is partially because there are certain pressing things like fighting back, xenophobic mobs in places like Chemnitz and other places that are, just of pressing concern. But I think that needs to be done. I mean, clearly what needs not to be done is what I think I said before, which is to sort of chase this false promise of sovereignty as if that is something that actually exists, rather than is actually simply part of this false dichotomy produced in the sort of conceptual worldscape of the neoliberals themselves. I think that to pursue sovereignty as if that is anything more than like a mobilization language or a kind of chimera that would, disappear as soon as we got close is the wrong thing to do.
I mean, what I was really struck by is Jed Purdy and Aziz Rana's critiques of the way in which the national and the sense of American exceptionalism infuses even this new conversation about democracy and its discontents, right? I mean, both of them wrote these brilliant pieces earlier this year, one in Dissent and the other one in N+1, I think, about the way in which the American left, or rather the kind of American centrist responses to Trump, which have moved us away, back to a conversation essentially about American principles and what America should stand for and what particular bit of the founding of America's glorious project is being violated this morning by the latest tweet, right? That this forces us back into a set of national preoccupations which are themselves not historicized. In other words, the image of the Constitution that is being violated is itself a product of the Cold War moment, because Americans didn't always think that way about their Constitution. If you read people like Wilson, they are really quite scandalously freewheeling about the Constitution, and something happens in the 50s, 60s, and 70s where you get this convergence of, as it were, the right and the center in the wake of the New Deal around this new image of America as this clean and beautiful, pristine thing on a hill somewhere. And that then is the object of their upset, to which Purdy and Rana, in my mind, very productively say, okay, well, that's all nonsense. We have to separate ourselves from it. But then what really strikes me is their next move is to reinscribe their much more hard-hitting notion of American history right back in America's history, just it's their own left version of America's history, in which Purdy actually says it, Trump is not the exception, he's the norm. The historic norm. In other words, I can tell you what the historic norm is, and that is the benchmark, comrades. And against that, we will now judge our mobilization strategy. And both of them make the move back to the Gilded Age in the 1920s. So against Trump's Make America Great Again, and the centrist Let's Make America Sane Again, they answer Let's Make America Radical Again. And to my mind, none of them are escaping the fundamental problem, which is much more like a sort of Arendt, Barraclough. The world just really isn't the same. And again, is the real problem in that entire trope. It's not great or sane or radical. It's, again, the very idea that there's any kind of do-over possibility. We're done. To my mind, at least, certainly speaking from a European point of view, it just seems ludicrous that this conversation is recurring. And in that conversation is inscribed the national. Right? That's where you see this tug of the national. It's incredibly difficult for American political conversations to escape this. And it seems to me that when we have, conversations about, John Keane, the Australian, kind of meta-theorist and global historian of democracy, has this extraordinary paper where he says something like, what can America learn, what can Americans learn about democracy from China? Now that sounds like a kind of Maoist period, once upon a time Americans took that question seriously, at least some of them did. Yeah. French people certainly took that question seriously once. Now, of course, it seems bonkers at one level because, China is this extraordinary souped up authoritarianism. But when we start having that conversation and somebody says, well, not from China, but then say from Spain, it seems to me we've entered the new age. We're breaking. But otherwise, I just don't trust American political discourse of any coloration right now. It all seems to me to be framed by this compulsive return to the national frame. Right, center, and left all seem to me to have that problem.
Well, look at something that's slightly more palatable in the case you brought up of Wolfgang Streeck, who's active in this sort of splinter left movement in Germany right now, where for good reason, the national is crossed out as a kind of, object to which one can hark back positively, right? So you can't say make Germany great again, no matter, not on the left anyway, nor can you even say make Germany radical again. Quite, Germany as a category is not really available. So for the left in Germany, the word that is used is social, right? So you defend the social model, you defend the social state. And the object of longing and nostalgia then becomes the immediate post-war period in 1950s and 60s West Germany when you got this great expansion of the welfare state.
It's hilarious. Sarah Wagenknecht will position herself as the legitimate heir of Ludwig Erhard.
Yeah. So her argument is if we read ordoliberalism closely enough, we can see it as a kind of a road to socialism. But I mean, what's interesting about that, I think, and actually, symptomatic and not just kind of a stretch of interpretation, is that the way that it's being framed now is a kind of a war of attrition, right? So the welfare state is cast as a kind of an island that needs to be defended at all costs. And what that then immediately turns into is a kind of a welfare chauvinism, where what this means is then we can't allow too many migrants in, they'll break the social model. It'll lead to wage dumping, which is a term that is used both by Wagenknecht and by Alice Weidel of the Alternative for Germany party. So this, even if you leave the nation out, you can also use the social as an exclusionary category right now. And I think both of those categories have the same blind spot that Adam is pointing to, which is simply the way in which prosperity, certainly in places like Germany and the United States, is not being kind of generated only domestically, but is completely imbricated and dependent on the prosperity and the well-being of all of the countries around it, and indeed around the world. So any attempt to, I think, cordon off the nation, even if you don't use the rightfully discredited categories of nationalism, is the wrong approach right now.
We have time for 2 more questions. At the front here, yeah, at the front. You.
Hi. I want to touch on the problem of debt and sovereignty, because you have been talking about borders. But so I come from Chile, and I just briefly look at your book, and there's not much discussion of the kind of the first implementation of neoliberal policies in Chile, and how in 1982, the crisis of the debt, actually the banks were intervened and was an act of sovereignty, and actually they are kept very tight until today. And when the crash came in here in the U.S., all in Chile were saying, well, they need to intervene the banks. So what I want to ask Adam about what was the decision-making process, or what led to these people to actually bail them out instead of intervening, and if ordoliberalism has something to do that is beyond the kind of the grip on the state on the economic crisis.
I mean, for me, the thing, this just segues directly off what Quinn just said, and it'll be as far as I'll go in taking up the temptation of the Strake argument. To me, debt has, in a certain sort of left discourse about the crisis, come to stand as the opposite of the social, and also as the opposite of democracy or the political. And that's actually explicit in Strake's political theorization, where he postulates 2 different types of folk, 2 different types of constituency, one a debt market constituency and one the citizens, and one is clearly legitimate and the other one is clearly fundamentally illegitimate. One is cosmopolitan, the other one is national. And what I find so important, really, and this goes back to Quinn's much more, I don't know why I didn't take this up, I was kind of reluctant at the end of our exchange, but this really does go to Quinn's point about openness, is what the crisis teaches is that for the vast majority of actors, debt is actually not that kind of oppressive relationship. If you have an activist central bank and some capacity to withstand the devaluation, you actually have a remarkable degree of freedom. You can do the most incredible crazy shit, as the British have demonstrated, with enormously high levels of debt, enormously high levels of international exposure, and you can get away with murder. I mean, nonsense, crazy talk, politicals, really, in some senses, like the most extraordinary display of political volition, advertised as such, advertised as a display of freedom and taking back control, and you don't get seriously punished. And that, I think, has been one of the really interesting questions. And of course, what that forces into the foreground is the question of power. It absolutely, crucially depends on 2 things: your position within the global system, whether you're the United States or even Switzerland or Britain or one of those kind of actors inside the protected bubble of a reasonably high bond rating, so you've got some way to fall, and on domestic power relations. In other words, who controls the central bank, what their relationship is with the key vehicles for capital mobility, and it becomes extraordinarily crystalline in its clarity, because at one end of the spectrum we have the Greeks, who are completely, really just pinned down and confined in every conceivable direction, and Varoufakis spells this out beautifully in his memoir about 2015. And on the other hand, you have an actor, which is frankly a rogue actor like the United Kingdom, with a gigantic banking sector, a crazy freewheeling internationalized center, which all comes down, has to be nationalized, extraordinary out of control, straight democratic referendum politics, and nothing bad happens. So I think if one allows, I think the left tend to read this kind of position as a sellout. It implies too much volition. It implies too much Keynesian agency. To my mind, what it exposes is the extraordinary nakedness of the power relationships which underpin this. It's another way of reading the history. It just, it shows us within what structural conditions you are able and able not to. So I can't comment on the Chile example specifically, but the history of the last 10 years shows us that, right? This incredible fungibility, this incredible flexibility in this system, dependent on power. And of course, power isn't just a static thing. It's a question of mobilization. It's a question of coalition building. It's a question of leverage, as we've seen within the Eurozone. There is one ECB in 2010 and 2011, and there's a radically different ECB in 2015 and 2016. And the Portuguese radical experiment, such as it is, hangs by the thread of one credit rating agency. But so long as it has that rating agency, Draghi will buy their bonds, and they can go on pursuing this very interesting experiment in reformist, cross-party left politics in Portugal, obviously with extreme limitations, but nevertheless not suffer the kind of suffocation that Greece did. And that depends on the complex geometry of this set of relationships.
Okay, last question. There's a hand there.
Buried in the back there.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering, since the crisis, we've seen, the massive influx of QE money, low rates, restrictions on bank regulatory capital requirements. We've seen kind of a shrinkage in the public markets, among other reasons, and kind of a rise of private markets. And we've seen companies like KKR and these private equity and private credit firms like Blackstone and Apollo, do everything from buying up middle market companies in the US to investing in distressed, loans in Italy to buying banks in Vietnam. And, India also, for the first time in a long time, has opened up to FDI in a very meaningful way. So my question is, we don't know so much about what private capital is doing, and given how that importance increases, what do we do when so much of capital is not public and let alone regulated or democratized?
That sounds like one for you.
So, this is a very interesting question, and it's a great corrective also to my emphasis on the kind of new transparency and the breakthroughs of the macro-financial regulatory politics, because those do apply really only to one set of institutions in the global economy, those which were most in the firing line, most at risk in 2008, those which are so conspicuous that it's very difficult for them to escape this kind of oversight at this moment. Whereas I completely agree that the zone that you're talking about is also deliberately constructed in some ways, I think, to escape this kind of regulation. And yet it's directly related to the story of 2008, because as people like Zoltan Posar have shown, who now works for Credit Suisse but was with the IMF and the New York Fed for a while, it's out of those private sources of cash, the so-called cash pools, which can be swung in one direction towards more long-term investment, but can also be swung into very short-term investment, which are looking for minimal risk. It was in that zone and it was out of that zone that the funding for the so-called shadow banking system was built up. And now, the sort of money you're talking about is looking for much longer-term investment. It's quite unlike the kind of cash pools that were mobilized before 2007 in that respect, but it shares with them a kind of opacity, a sense that they're somewhat off the radar of observation. And the very least I think one can say at the moment is there is now a heightened awareness of the Rumsfeldian uncertainty. There is a heightened awareness of the unknown unknowns. Because we've had this experience of 2007, 2008, there is a sense in which people are scanning the global system for those types of new risk and the kind of actors that are engaged in them. And we have kind of a priori guesses about what they might look like, and they do indeed look like some of those kind of actors. Those might be the kind of bottleneck actors, the ones that might run quickly, that would generate very heavy pressure on emerging markets at crucial moments. That we can go as far as that, and then we do in fact run into not the Hayekian kind of metaphysics, but the resistance of interest. I mean, these things exist. They are, as it were, in the same realm as the tax havens. That's why they're there. They're precisely to deliver this kind of private, true privacy in a world which isn't really quite as private as the very wealthy would really like it to be. So beyond the general premises of neoliberalism, something a whole lot darker even than that. Like, not just general Hayekian obscurity, but true anonymity.
Right.
You then become the Hayekian, Hayek tells us there's something there, you just can't know about it.
Right.
Whereas these folks want to get to the other side of the Rumsfeldian screen. They want to be unknown unknowns.
Right.
That's precisely where they want to be, like out the other side, so that they're not really visible at all. And that remains a huge problem for accounting. Students of Cyrus and Piketty are doing brilliant work in trying precisely to uncover, almost through a process of through elimination, where that money must be in the global system, because it's not showing up in these accounts or those accounts. So what's the name of the French guy? Yeah, exactly. So anyway, it's an important part of the new world for sure.
Can I ask you a question, and that kind of folds in an answer to a couple of these questions, specifically to the question of banking and central banking? I mean, I think that one thing that is clear, should be clear from both my book and from your book, is that one can't and shouldn't see central banks as simply sort of agents of neoliberalism, whatever we consider that to be. I mean, I think one thing that your narrative does is sort of recovers a lot of autonomy at some level for the central bankers. And we know now that your book is being read closely by precisely this kind of financial elite, this financial leadership class. And at some point, I sort of was imagining your book as being written for them, like you were kind of remonstrating with them in the way that sort of, the Chinese scholar courtiers would remonstrate with the emperor. So the question is, what is your best hope for what they can learn from your book? I mean, is the best we can hope for that they don't allow the system to explode and hopefully preserve the status quo? Or do you have any kind of optimism for a kind of a more progressive species of central banking practice coming out of this?
That's a very nice way of putting a point which has been made in less nice ways. About
I haven't read.
I really appreciate the tone in which that was delivered. There's certainly an element of truth in that. This is a top-down history, unashamedly so.
But history is produced often in top-down ways. So
exactly, at least one version. Of course, it does in no way precludes or excludes any other type, and nor does it. I'm really uncomfortable with this claim that it's a definitive history. I mean, it's very big. That's all it is. It's but it's just a gigantic sketch with certain urgent propositions, and the urgency does in part come from the fact that I do think there has been some learning. And there's no doubt at all that I now actually am moving beyond just simply fantasizing about it. I do think that for the left, a key part of any reformist strategy now has got to be a conversation about what we imagine a progressive central banker would be. Because these people have huge leverage. We have built a system, or a system was built from the 1980s onwards, which confirmed enormous power on them. Yeah. And we may want in due course to systematically dismantle and change that, but we are going to need an interim phase at the very least in which we are going to have to work with this system. And it does have some rather attractive properties as a means of power. And we know historically what a huge difference it makes whether you've got somebody like Trichet running a central bank or somebody like Draghi. And that isn't to turn Draghi into some kind of liberal, but pains to insist that he isn't. But certainly not in the American sense of liberal. But it does matter, and I think the same is true with banking regulation as well. If one is serious about progressive economic policy at this moment, we have to get serious about macroprudentialism and what possibilities it opens up, which is a technical area, but that's the sort of the task that's open for us. That just seems to me to be realistic thinking. Sure. I mean, in the sense that both the Clinton and the Obama administrations have huge problems. I mean, are profoundly shaped, let's put it this way, and in a way which, from the point of view of progressive politics, is surely to be regretted by the fact that they were almost entirely dependent on inherited expertise which they got out of the Wall Street Treasury nexus if they weren't actually establishing that expertise. If we think about the possibility, for instance, of a Corbyn government in the United Kingdom, it's crucial. All the way back to Miliband and Poulantzas, we know the British state is not a neutral thing. If you are going to actually pursue a radical politics in Britain, you better be prepared to fight inside those institutions, and that means you have to come equipped with expertise, and that needs to be backed up by some kind of political muscle, so you can fire people and fire them properly. And Mervyn King, for instance, in the Crisis, exercised explicit and conservative political pressure towards austerity. The same is true in the Eurozone. It matters an enormous amount whether the SPD within the Great Coalition is able essentially to resist Biden's appointment as a successor to Draghi, which would be a disaster for the Eurozone in its current form. So yes, I mean, as limited as this is, this is the agenda. I take it actually to be broadly understood, and this, if this book serves as any kind of useful summary of where we're at, great.
Great, yeah.
Well, that's all for tonight. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Adam and Quinn, for participating, and we'll let you all go.
Thank you.